Hey y'all, it's Kate from the Little Apothecary and welcome back to my channel.
I am back with another episode of Battle of the Books 2024 edition. Today we're doing part 1 of round 2, where some of the books that we talked about in the past first round have now moved on and are up against other books. Some of these books that you'll hear about got buys from the first round, and so this is the first time you're hearing about them in this series, and I'm just gonna dive right in. We have, I think, 16 different matchups, so let's just jump right in. First up, we have the Bloodstones versus Proven Guilty. The Bloodstones was a fantasy book that was written by Tori Tecking, and I loved it. Proven Guilty is another Dresden book, and I love those so much. They get better as the books go on, but I also am terrible at keeping track of which book is which, so I have no idea which book Proven Guilty is, and so I'm going to give this one to the Bloodstones because I can't wait to see where Tori Tecking takes that series. Next up, we have Pink Eye versus An Unkindness of Magicians. Now, Pink Eye was a science fiction book. It was short, but it just didn't do it for me. It just made the cut for this series. I think I gave it a very low 3-star rating. I just had too many questions left over. An Unkindness of Magicians is a fun, dark fantasy where we're in the middle of, I believe it was New York, and our magicians are hidden, but they're coming out, and there's chaos everywhere, and I loved it, and I can't wait to continue that series. So this round is going to go to An Unkindness of Magicians. Next up, we have You Say More Than You Think, which was a nonfiction book that I borrowed from John's mother. This book was about how your body image and your posture and the way that you stand and walk and interact with people say more than your actual words do sometimes, which was really interesting to read. That's up against The Three Musketeers, which I think has become one of my favorite classics now. I loved that book so much. This round I give to The Three Musketeers, which John will be happy about. I am giving this round to John over John's mom because John picked me to read The Three Musketeers on one of my Patreon picks, and so he'll be very excited to see that. Next up, we have Small Favor by Jim Butcher, another Dresden book, versus Becoming a Druid, which is a fantasy self-pub book about druids and this main character's journey to become a druid, which I absolutely loved. I did some beta reading, proofreading, editing for some novellas that Michael Moman did, and I have the other 2 books in that series that I still have to read. I think I'm going to give this one to Dresden though, because I remember really, really liking Small Favorite. I think that was one of my favorite Dresdens that I've read so far, and I feel like I haven't yet found my favorite Michael Moman Druid book. Next up, we have The Delve by Danny Finn versus The Force Unleashed. This is a hard one because we have a fantasy, dark fantasy, romance, LGBT rep book that's self-pub versus a Star Wars books that John picked that kind of showed you the dark side of the Force, and you got a really different perspective of that we don't get in the mainstream movies. I think I'm gonna go with The Force Unleashed here. I did not expect me to pass this one on, but I think I'm gonna go with The Force Unleashed. The next up, we have The Queen's Gambit by Walter Tevis versus Book of Night. Queen's Gambit is a historical fiction book about a young girl who was orphaned and then adopted, and she's a chess prodigy, and I loved seeing her journey, and I really, really want to watch that movie, or I think it's a TV show maybe, but I'm waiting for John and the perfect moment for that. Book of Night was an interesting dark fantasy where shadows are kind of the magic here, and I just had a lot of questions with Book of Night. I wanted to know a lot more than we got in that first book, so I'm going to give this one to The Queen's Gambit. Next up, we have Wild Card, which was a Dresden graphic novel, versus Ancient as the Stars, which I just did my video review for that. That's a science fiction book that I absolutely loved. It was one of the best science fiction books I've read in a long time. I loved seeing Dresden in graphic novel form, but I feel like some of the Dresden stories do better in novel form, and I feel like Wildcard was one of those. So I'm gonna give this one to Ancient as the Stars. Next up, we have Blackcap, which was a novella I read for the Sphinx Championship series, versus Influencer, which was a nonfiction book about how to become a top influencer, no matter what you're selling. This is a really hard one because neither one really stood out in my mind. This round of book matchups are harder than the first two rounds for sure. Blackcap I enjoyed, but I wanted more. Influencer, I found that while it wasn't quite hitting for me yet, it might in the future if my channel continues to grow. I think I'm going to give this one to Blackcap because that one I got more out of than I did Influencer. Next up, this is maybe the hardest one I've had so far. We have I Was a Teenage Slasher by Stephen Graham Jones versus A Fire Endless by Rebecca Ross, which is book 2 in the Elements of Cadence duology, which I loved that duology. I have to give this one to Stephen Graham Jones though, because I Was a Teenage Slasher was phenomenal. It had me crying for a slasher. It had me jumping. It had me sitting there staring at the wall at moments. That ending was amazing, and I can't stop talking about I Was a Teenage Slasher. I have another Stephen Graham Jones book coming up in, I think it comes out in March, so I'll probably read it in February, or maybe it comes out in April and I'll read it in March. One or the other, and I'm really excited for it because I've read 2 Stephen Graham Jones books now and I've loved them, so I can't wait to dive into more. Our next matchup is The Children of the Black Moon versus The New World. Children of the Black Moon was a book by Joseph John Lee, which is part of the Gunslinger and Spellbinder series. The first book in that series was The Bleeding Stone. The New World was I think it was like a prequel novella for a series I didn't really have any intention in reading until I read it. It was one of those random books that ended up on my Audible account, and so I listened to the audiobook and I really enjoyed it, but I'm going to give this one to Children of the Black Moon because that whole series just did things to me. Next up, we have Under the Greenwood Tree, which I believe is a Thomas Hardy novel, versus We Solve Murders. I have a really hard time with Thomas Hardy novels. I've read a couple now, and they just did not land for me. We Solve Murders, however, did absolutely land. The cool thing about this matchup is this was 2 books that I listened to an audiobook, and We Solve Murders was just fantastic. I listened to it in December as I was traveling for work, and it was a perfect book for me at that time. Under the Greenwood Tree, if it wasn't for Alan Rickman narrating it, I would have DNF'd it a long time ago. It would have been a very early DNF. So I'm going to give this one to We Solve Murders. Only a couple left. We're getting there. Next up, we have Song of the Samurai versus Upscaled. Song of the Samurai, this is not as hard as I thought it was. Song of the Samurai I enjoyed. It's a historical fiction with maybe a little bit of fantasy in there. Book about a samurai who is banished from his temple and he has to go to a different one, and he takes his journey through the country and learns about all these different kinds of samurais and the different temples that he meets. And I really liked it, but Upscaled was just adorable. This is another Joseph John Lee book, and this is the first book in this series. It's kind of a YA series. It's about a baby dragon who's just trying to have a birthday party, and he loves pies, and I fell in love from the start. From the cover, I fell in love, and I really hoped that Joe Lee would not give us a tearbreaker in this one. And I can tell you, Upscaled is cozy, it is fantastic, and I loved it, and I can't wait for the next book in that series. Just 4 more matchups left in this part 1 video. We have the Reincarnationist Papers versus the Wishing Stone. This is a tricky one. I read the Reincarnationist papers because I watched the movie that it was based off of, and it got me really, really, really interested in reincarnation and the whole idea. And the premise of this book is that these reincarnationists remember their past lives, and not always do. They say in this book that we all are reincarnationists, and just the people that are known to be reincarnationists are the ones that remember their past lives, and the others just don't remember. And I found that really, really interesting. The Wishing Stone was the second novella in the Gam series. The first book was a necromancer called Gam by Adam Holcomb, and I loved both of those books so much. They are so cozy and cute and adorable. I love Gam and I love Mina, and I forget the other kid's name, but I also loved him. And I think I have to give this one to Adam Holcomb because that whole world that he's created with Gam and Mina is just so near and dear to my heart. I love it. Next matchup is the Diviners by Libba Bray versus the Faculty Lounge. This one goes to the Diviners. The Faculty Lounge was a contemporary fiction I read the arc of. It's got some weird stuff going on. It takes place in a Texas high school, and this starts off with a substitute being found dead in the Faculty Lounge, and crazy stuff happens to the PTA parents and kids happening and nurses, and you know, I enjoyed it. I liked it, but the Diviners was just a whole different level. This was a historical fiction YA dark fantasy takes place in the 1920s in New York City. And y'all, the Flapper Society, the Flapper time in the 1920s is like one of those times that my heart just latches onto. I don't know what it is about the 20s and Prohibition and the Flappers, but I can't get enough of books that takes place during that time. So this matchup goes to the Diviners, definitely. Next up, we have Butcher and Blackbird versus White Knight. This one goes to Butcher and Blackbird because that was a serial killer romance that I did not have on the menu for 2024. But y'all, that book blew my mind away. That was one of my favorite books of the whole year. I can't wait to continue that series. I loved it so much. White Knight is, again, another Dresden book, which I love. I loved them all. Can't tell you what happens in it. I'm guessing this one has to do with Michael because it has the word knight in it, and he was a knight of something or other. But this one goes to Butcher and Blackbird for sure. And the last matchup of this video is Silverskin versus Sordaneon. Now this one is a tricky one. Silverskin was this supernatural, dark, with horror elements, fantasy maybe, takes place in Alaska, and it deals with some Alaskan myths, and I loved it. Sordaneon is another fantasy that had really interesting magic in it, and I really want to continue that series, but I think I'm going to give this one to Silverskin because that was such a unique book that I would not have read if the author didn't reach out to me, and I'm so glad that she did. So this one goes to Silverskin. That's it for now. That's round 2, part 1. We'll come up in the next week with part 2 of this round with the other half of our matchups. Let me know in the comments below which picks surprised you and which ones you would have chosen if you had to make these picks. As always, keep reading, and I love you all to the moon and back. Bye.